We begin tonight with a fragile ceasefire in Syria, a first step on the long road to a lasting peace, possibly. Special Envoy Kofi Annan says the situation is not ideal, but he calls it a, and I quote, chance to be seized. Annan says Syrian streets are now relatively calm after this morning's deadline to stop the violence, but he says the regime is not complying with all requirements of his peace plan, including withdrawing tanks and troops from protest cities. Both the regime and opposition accuse each other of violating the truce with sporadic attacks. One opposition group is reporting 21 new deaths. Earlier, we asked an activist in Hama what he'd seen today.
Today, nothing has changed concerning the practices of the regime. For example, in Al-Madik citadel, there was peaceful demonstration. And when the demonstration started, soldiers from the historical citadel started to open fire on the civilians. Many of them wounded, and they arrested big number of them. So we can't say that the regime will change his tactics, because they have been using them for 40 years and they can't change in day and night.
The message from Hama in Syria this evening. Well, CNN's Ivan Watson is monitoring the latest on the ceasefire from across the border in Turkey. Our Richard Roth is following developments at the UN in New York, where diplomats are demanding Syria's actions match its words. And Nick Robertson here in the studio, CNN's senior international correspondent, who's been in and out of Syria over the past year, reporting on the crisis as it's developed. He's here with me tonight to analyse the prospects for peace and what might happen next. Let's begin tonight with you, Ivan, in Turkey.
Well, Becky, we talked to a resident in the city of Homs, which has been subjected to months of bombardment. And he said for the first time in months, he woke up to the sounds of birds chirping, not bombs exploding. And it does seem there was a relative lull in the violence. But activists were very quick to point out that the Syrian government had not complied with one of the key steps in the 6-point peace plan brokered by the United Nations, which was to withdraw forces from Syrian cities and towns. And we've seen video of checkpoints of tanks dug in those cities and towns, not moving. There have been allegations of violations of the ceasefire agreement. The Syrian state media reporting that a bomb blew up an army bus, killing an army lieutenant and wounding more than 20 others in the city of Aleppo. And Syrian activists have claimed that there were acts of violence committed by Syrian security forces. We've gotten different numbers for the amounts of people that they claim were killed. We've seen some videos of a funeral in Idlib province. Now, one of the provisions of the ceasefire agreement is to allow independent observers in, both the United Nations observer mission that has been proposed and journalists like ourselves, but we have not been allowed entry in. We're reporting from outside. We talked to some of the 25,000 Syrian refugees living in camps here in Turkey, asked one of them if he trusts this ceasefire agreement. Take a listen to what he had to say.
I don't believe there is ceasefires now. There's a lot of places now still shelling. My town, for example, I talked to my family, is still shelling by security forces and the army.
And one final point, the Syrian opposition has lobbied for public protests to take advantage of this lull in the fighting, to go out in the streets. We've seen people forming a human SOS sign outside the city of Aleppo, and this will be a big challenge. Will the Syrian security forces tolerate protests against the government? The peace plan calls for peaceful, for allowing political demonstrations in Syria, something that the government has not tolerated in more than a year of violence that has claimed more than 9,000 lives, Becky.
One of the question marks, of course, tonight amongst many. Ivan, thank you for that. Ivan's in Turkey, covering the story from just across the border there. Let's get you to New York now and to the United Nations headquarters, where plans are in the works to send an observer mission, as Ivan suggested, to oversee the next stage of this Annan plan. Richard, what do we know of those plans at this point?
Diplomats are working on it. Could very well be approved on Friday, New York time, to get initially some monitors on the ground in Syria to determine just how much the Damascus regime is cooperating, and perhaps the opposition also too. The ambassadors here inside the Security Council listened to a closed-door briefing by Kofi Annan by video teleconference. Though Susan Rice, the U.S. ambassador, said that Annan said that Syria was not fully complying on the 6 points, the ambassador disagreed and also said, stop focusing on my government. In effect, let's look at the groups that are trying to attack the Syrian government.
As long as the Syrian government is concerned, I could confirm to you and stress upon this that the Syrian government has ended the violence on its side. And we expect those who have influence over the armed groups to do the same.
That has been a steady theme from Syria's representative here in New York, but much of the focus remains on just how much is the government doing to cooperate. It's a 6-point plan, and very few diplomats here are willing to give Syria many points for cooperating, and there's still a lot of caution.
Its track record up until today has been dismal. We hope, but we clearly remain cautious in our assessment that today becomes the start of a new way forward. But I think, frankly, we have a year's worth of evidence that leads us all to enormous skepticism.
President Obama, President Sarkozy of France, in a statement, both calling on the Syrian government to fully implement the Annan plan. As Ivan and as you, Becky, have discussed, there's still a lot for the government there to do. They're trying to get together these observers in the next few days to go there. They'll be unarmed, and only then, if things remain calm, would a larger monitoring mission be established on the ground. Back to you.
Sure. All right, Richard Roth out of the UN for you this evening. I'll get you some perspective on all of this from our senior international correspondent, Nick Robertson, here with me in the studio in just a moment. First, though, I want to get you some very different takes on this, let's call it a fragile ceasefire deal. I spoke to some Syrians living here in London earlier on today. Have a listen to this.
My name is Ammar Waqqaf. I'm a management consultant in the UK. I'm part of a group called the Syrian Social Club in London, and we promote regime reform rather than regime change.
I'm Reem Turkmani. I'm a Syrian astrophysicist who work in London, and I work for building the Syrian state opposition current. We want a peaceful transition of power in Syria.
My name is Anas Nader. I'm a medical student here in London. I work closely with several groups such as Avaz and Stand By Syria to get information and raise awareness.
Is this a tactical ceasefire by the Bashar al-Assad regime?
It could be also a tactical one from the opposition side, or from the armed group side, or from the regional players' side. We don't know. But I think it's sort of a needed halt of the activities to see where to go next.
I think it's a tactical move, and I think they're buying time with that. In many ways, it's a sign that they're feeling the pressure, they're feeling the heat, and they want to try to calm down the international community by acting like they're willing to cease fire. That doesn't mean that they're willing to change their methods or that they're willing to give a true chance for the opposition.
I think they were forced to do it.
What happens if this ceasefire doesn't hold?
I think it's time right now to move on for immediate international pressure and maybe even intervention of some sort.
What sort of intervention are you talking about? Boots on the ground? No fly zones?
What most Syrians would want at this point, and mainly the opposition and the Free Syrian Army, would be basically supporting the Free Syrian Army logistically and providing them with arms.
Hundreds of people are being killed every day. We have to stop the bloodshed. We shouldn't just keep calling for things that may never happen. Nobody seems to be willing to interfere in the international community. I can argue for hours with you that why this is not a good thing, but there's nobody ready to do it.
I would exclude really any solution that would, multiply the number of dead we have already in Syria.
Assad has signed up to a peace plan which pledges peaceful protest going forward. Does anybody buy that potential?
I would want to see peaceful protest very much. If somebody would want to protest, then please let it be peaceful.
I don't think the regime is honest.
I don't think the regime will ever allow protests. They fear from protests. They know that the minute they actually allow for open protests to come down the streets, hundreds of thousands of people can be on the streets, and that's going to be the beginning of the end for them. And to give you an example, just a few days ago, we probably all heard the story of that one woman in Damascus came down the street with one sign. They even say down to the regime. All that sign said, "Stop the bloodshed." It could be a sign for both sides. and she's been arrested, and no one knows where she is right now. And that's one woman, not tens or hundreds or thousands, just one woman in the streets of Damascus. So this regime does not want any form of protest.
I think we tend to forget it is the duty of the government to, protect its citizens.
And does that by arresting that woman, by holding that sign, is that protecting?
I'm not talking about this particular one.
Okay.
That's just one story.
Every day there is mortar shelling on civilian areas in Homs. Even if there are armed groups inside this area, does this give the regime the right to bomb it using weapon that kills left, right, and center, doesn't distinguish between women,
yes or no?
Women or children?
Obviously, no.
Right. Is this now, or has this developed into, a sectarian conflict?
Sadly, I think we might kind of all agree on this one, but I think it's the consequence. The answer is yes, but I think it's the consequence and result of the regime's, first of all, 40 years of divide and conquer kind of policy, but even more now, by even spreading more fear among the minorities.
It's not a sectarian conflict yet. There's a sectarian friction, especially in areas like Homs, but it's not sectarian war yet, civil war.
You support a regime which has no sense of inclusivity so far as the sectarian nature of its population.
I disagree a little bit. I think the state is pretty much inclusive to all sects. Everyone is really representative rather than represented really in terms of ethnicity, in terms of sectarian issues.
That's just simply not true, is it?
This regime is not inclusive politically. It may have people from different religions and ethnic backgrounds in its fronts, but it doesn't mean that it has different people from different political backgrounds. It certainly have no place for me, and I have no place for Anas, and this is the most important thing.
I want to get a final word from each of you.
Well, in a sense, I would want this peace plan to work. I don't think it will very much, but I would want it to work. I would want international community to put some pressure on all parties, not only the Syrian government. And I hope that if this somehow works, then probably this would be, a door open to a peaceful resolution of this conflict.
If we all rally behind it, it will work.
Anas?
I don't trust the regime. I don't think it's going to work. And we're going to need some international help.
Well, some say the real test of the Syrian ceasefire could come tomorrow, Friday. Activists are urging demonstrators to go back on the streets en masse after Friday prayers. Let's bring in Nick Robertson, as I've been promising, for some final thoughts now on this story. A ceasefire of sorts, Nick, at this point, 18 hours after the deadline was enacted. Having listened to that discussion and given what we know of the situation on the ground today, your thoughts on what happens next?
Tomorrow's going to be a very, very difficult day. This is the day, traditionally Friday, when there are the biggest protests. Now people will feel sort of emboldened. Activists will feel that they can come out, that they've got something to prove, to show to the world while the world is still watching. Can we go out and get the freedom that the peace plan calls for? And if the answer turns out to be no, they're going to want the world to see that. I spoke to an activist in Damascus this evening. He said some protesters, anti-government protesters, had already tried to go to the parliament, which is likely to be one of the focus places, government buildings, that they tried to do today, and some of those people were arrested. So that's going to be the test. And while the ceasefire is fragile, it can really go anyway. There are no UN monitors there on the ground yet to even see what's happening.
The story continues. Nick Robertson, always a pleasure in the studio for you this evening, our senior international correspondent in and out of Syria, of course, over the past year, covering the regional story for decades. Still to come tonight.